All right, welcome. Yet again, you're here with me, Jay Dyer from Jay's Analysis. And Nina Byzantina joins us once again. She was with us a couple years ago. We talked history, we talked the history of Russia. And lately, she's been doing some different material. She's doing material on the human predator. Nina, how are you?
Thank you for having me. I'm doing well. As I was just telling you, I'm a little bit sleep deprived. So if I sound like Joe Biden, it's not dementia, it's sleep deprivation. So just to clarify.
Well,
So yes,
if
this
I
is
start
a
talking
little
nonsense gibberish, would you feel more at home, like Joe Biden?
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So yes, this is a little bit of a departure. And as a side note, I'm still considering doing something more along the lines of geopolitics and Russia related politics. But as you know, with all the censorship on these platforms, it's
Yeah.
a little bit of a tricky subject to be able to disseminate certain types of information that doesn't quite fit the mainstream narrative, but at the same time is mainstream enough
Right.
to not be banned, basically. So I'm still thinking about it and I would love to do it, but so far I'll just stick to Twitter. So yes, this is definitely not my usual subject.
So let's move into that. So now you want to empower all of the wine moms out there to be able to do their own home diagnosis of everybody in their family to be a psychopath. I'm just kidding.
Absolutely.
No, but that is what happens. Like everybody starts clicking on YouTube, and they're like, oh, then suddenly everybody in the family is a psychopath.
Yeah, it's like if you have a cough and you Google the symptoms, you probably nowadays think you have coronavirus, which
Right.
yes, you probably do not. Yeah, there is definitely is that downside to kind of more clickbait type content regarding the subject of personality disorders in the cluster B, or simply I like to call them human predators. Other people like to call them toxic people, manipulators, dysfunctional personalities. I actually really like this book by former FBI agent Joe Navarro. He calls them dangerous personalities. So it's kind of like that same premise that
Yes.
we stay away from diagnosing people because we're not mental health professionals. And at the same time, I think it's very helpful to outline certain traits that are harmful in interpersonal relationships, in the workplace, in the family, romantic relationships, and they're harmful across the board over the long term. So it's not, one-off incidents that we
But
could all be
now
guilty of.
Nina, you're saying that if I watched enough of the Dr. Phil videos, that I could give a qualified analysis as a
It's funny
medical
that you
professional.
it's funny that you mentioned this because there's some pretty interesting analyses of Dr. Phil being
Oh,
somewhat
really?
narcissistic. So if you wanted to go down a rabbit hole of other people analyzing Dr. Phil after this, no, I'm
That's so
serious.
meta.
They're
That's so
literally,
meta.
yes, yes, it totally is.
Right.
It's pretty interesting. So
All right, so let's talk about some of your early videos. So you started after you'd read a bunch on the topic, and I did enjoy I watched all the videos. So you're not coming from a vantage point of attempting to pass yourself off as anything. You're just trying to give an honest analysis of your own personal research based on multiple books and I guess a few years of looking into this topic. So let's start with like the first red flags. It doesn't have to be any specific numbers, but what are the red flags that you notice in a human predator that come out at the get go?
well, the red flags are, it really depends on the situation, but for instance, if someone has certain narcissistic traits, and it doesn't matter whether they qualify for a clinical diagnosis, you would notice either excessive grandiosity. And the way this would be presented, let's say you are going to a restaurant with a friend or, romantic prospect, this person is not going to treat the wait staff well or the cab driver. They may denigrate them to kind of place themselves above this person, and it might be done in really subtle ways. So you might write this off that, he or she is having a bad day. That's why he's being mean to the cab driver, or he's making the waiter pronounce the name of the wine correctly because he or she thinks this is not the way you pronounce the name of the wine. But literally, these things, when they happen kind of here and there are probably something that you are not going to pay attention to unless you have had your own negative personal experiences.
And then, it's pronounced Franzia, and it's the finest of the boxed wines.
Believe it or not, I have witnessed and I have heard of situations like this, and I know what other behaviors the individuals I'm thinking of engage in. So it actually does happen. So, and obviously a lot of times it happens with the person who is narcissistic, who is in a position of power. So for them to denigrate the service staff, that really says a lot, because by definition, they're above them, so to speak, in terms of social status. So you would notice things like that. You would notice the fact that they might not be the most punctual person. And of course, some of us are late once in a while. It happens. And eventually you realize it happens all the time. And basically the premise here is we do not start until I get here. So a lot of the red flags could be, things that you will write off from the beginning. You would notice that this person may have a short fuse, but it would be over minor issues. This person would really get angry and it would be disproportionate to the subject at hand. Then this person would cool down, maybe even apologize and own that incident by saying, oh, I need to work on this. I realize this is a flaw. And you would actually probably be impressed. Oh my gosh, he or she actually has this amazing level of self-reflection. So the point here is that the red flags might be really minor in the beginning, and you always kind of have to look at the context and how often they happen and look at them over the long term. So I think one of the most common things for narcissism in a romantic relationship, if you've binge watched the narcissism videos, is love bombing, where you meet your romantic prospect and all of a sudden you're soulmates within a week. Things that are kind of disproportionate or moving too fast. So it really depends on whether this is, boyfriend, girlfriend, boss, family member, and so forth. So yes, in the very beginning, if this is a new person, it might not be obvious, which is why the lack of public education about the subject as kind of a street smarts type thing is pretty remarkable.
Well, the love bombing, of course, comes up in the subject of cults, and we've done a lot of interviews and discussions on cult leaders.
It's actually amazing because a lot of that psychology
is the same,
including YouTubers who are not psychologists but who've researched a lot of the subject, is actually directly linked to cults. So a lot of the terminology is directly lifted from cult psychology. So.
One question before you move on, as you're talking about the red flags about these characteristics, is there a specific distinction in your mind between excessive grandiosity and a God complex? Does every narcissist have the God complex, or not necessarily?
Well, officially, according to the diagnostic criteria, there are two types of narcissisms, and they're not necessarily in two completely separate boxes. So as one person over the course of their lifetime who is very disordered might actually go from one to the other. So one is grandiose and one is vulnerable. So it would actually be, in the way it's displayed to the public, this person would actually seem almost shy and actually self-denigrating, whereas kind of behind the scenes they would perceive themselves as superior to everyone else. And it's actually something that comes up a lot I did that little video on incels, and I had, it's a new channel, very guerrilla, so it was kind of funny to get a lot of hate mail because it clearly struck a chord when I talked about the vulnerable narcissistic traits in some of the more pronounced incel characters, things you see on message boards and of course in the news media. So there are the two types of narcissisms, but I think the problem with, despite this newer public education on YouTube, some of which involves actual mental health professionals, most people, when you say narcissist, they think, oh, it's someone who likes to look in the mirror. Oh, well, it's someone who likes to take selfies. And that is grandiose, although it's a little bit more murky nowadays because everyone has social media, and you and I are on social media as more so for you as a public figure, so it's almost like you're required to to post the occasional selfie, even if you have absolutely no need for that validation. So, but regardless of that, let's say you do need to be validated by posting photos of yourself and everyone says how good looking you are. That's one of the least harmful traits of narcissism. And sadly, what people think without researching it, that's what that is. And if you were to say who's a psychopath, they would say, oh, Ted Bundy, serial killers. Right. They're not going to say a banker, a Hollywood producer, a CEO, a politician. Whereas in reality, the most successful psychopaths, I mean, they may not be at the highest rating of the psychopathy checklist, but they may be, they may be subclinical or just qualifying for that box, mental health box, but they're actually successful as opposed to the guys who are in prison who are less successful. That's why they're in prison.
Good point.
So again, in terms of disseminating this kind of information, it's really lacking. So if you think about, I don't know if you've heard of him, Dr. Robert Hare, who is this seminal figure in Canadian mental health, and he's world renowned, and he's the man who established the psychopathy checklist, which is used in prison analysis and so forth. A lot of his popular books state the same thing, and he says, I've spent decades researching psychopaths in prison. Had I not done this, I should have gone to the Vancouver Stock Exchange, which is a pretty scary thing to think about. So, one of his very useful books is called Snakes in Suits, and it's about the psychopath in the workplace. Yes, I'm familiar. And people do not think about that. They do not think that, you do Hollywood stuff a lot. They do not think that the Hollywood producer, director, actor may be somewhat psychopathic.
Oh, absolutely.
Or the politician might be somewhat psychopathic.
Yes.
Or if you're interested, you could Google Hillary Clinton and psychopathy and see some of these analyses, which are not diagnoses, but they're analyses. There's some interesting stuff specifically about her and psychopathy by people who are kind of analyzing public information. So that's certainly not what comes to mind. People
so what you're saying is vote for Bernie because he's the non-psychopath candidate, right?
The only, which is why he's always kept away from the center of psychopathy. But yeah, I mean, it's the regular man on the street would say Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy. He's not going to say the politician, the journalist, the Hollywood producer. So.
Yes, that's a great point. Let me ask a couple weird questions. So, are you familiar with the Reddit designation from some years back of the Ham Planet?
I am not, but I'm actually looking into Reddit because it's pretty fascinating. So what does it refer to?
So this was the name that the Redditors of 10 years ago gave to the extremely overweight people. And this is the people who tend to can't get out of the bed, and they have to ride the scooter everywhere they go. They have to get out of a van in a scooter to go to Walmart in a scooter. You know what I mean? This kind of person. Yes. And what was interesting about this whole long thread on Reddit, I read a whole bunch of it after Jamie had sent it to me one night, was that a lot of people had noticed that the people who have these health issues that are this big, a lot of times they didn't have the mindset and the attitude that you would expect. You might expect that they all had a very sort of I have no self-esteem and I can't, but actually quite a few of them were the opposite. They were the vulnerable narcissists who were extremely manipulative and extremely entitled, and like everything I deserve a Coca-Cola, I deserve an Escalade, I deserve everything is owed to them. And they had to, it was just bizarre. It's not what you would expect.
Well, there's also kind of this opposite theory, which is a lot more sad. And I don't know if statistical studies have been done, but if you look at books like The Body Keeps Score, which talks about trauma, it's another popular book. It's actually very hard to read. It's disturbing. It talks about people with very serious weight issues, possibly experiencing sexual abuse as children. And so that is their way to make themselves less attractive by basically putting on more and more weight. And there are some studies, again, I don't think the subject has been sufficiently researched, but it's actually very disturbing if you think about the way our culture promotes body positivity beyond any reason nowadays. And sometimes you see people who clearly likely have psychosomatic issues. That is, it's clearly not just a weight issue.
Funny you said that, because I
And
just saw
you're basically validating someone who possibly could have been sexually abused as a child.
Interesting.
So
because Dr. Phil said that the other day. I hate to keep referencing.
Yes.
I got addicted the other day to watching like 20 Dr. Phil clips in a row, and that's why I keep that. One of them was
they're certainly advertised to me, and it's
I think they're funny.
Stuff.
Like I die laughing at half of them.
I'm not sure what's more disturbing, that he still has a show, or the fact that I would get those ads in my feed. So obviously we're getting the same advertising.
Well, he said there was a guy who was one of these Ham Planet people who couldn't stop. But the weird part was that he went on one of these TV shows and he got famous for being, the greatest loser, and he lost like 500 pounds. He became a trainer, and then he got the weight all back. He gained it all back and got back to being like 700 pounds. And that's exactly what Dr. Phil said. So I know you're right, because Dr. Phil backs you up, and and he said, you are putting on layers of coats. You're just adding another coat on top of a coat to hide.
If you think about the cultural implications of taking body positivity to kind of an irrational extent, it has some pretty disturbing implications. And I know you like to dive down the rabbit hole of, pedophiles in Hollywood, et cetera, et cetera. So if you think about the way that is being promoted, thereby validating possible sexual abuse, I mean, I find that disturbing. So
yeah. Did you ever see that Russian film Branded?
I don't think so.
The critics bombed it. I think they bombed it because it kind of had a positive message, but the part of the message of the film was that a lot of the corporate elite were actually intentionally promoting the quote body positive message to fatten up the stupid population. It was actually the premise of the film. So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could. Yeah, I mean, I think you can analyze it in many different ways, and you probably wouldn't be too far from what's happening. It's a little bit more complex than this single reading, but actually, what I wanted to do is to kind of bring this closer to you. I noticed that a lot of times you validate the trolls who attack you. Now, as someone who is also on Twitter, I know sometimes it is a very good social media strategy, because you can mock them, you could bring attention to how insane the accusations are, and that gives you additional attention, and it promotes your message, et cetera, et cetera. So I understand all that, and I sometimes do the same. But I would say that, in my opinion, you validate too many trolls, and it might sound like a very Captain Obvious thing to say. Oh, well, don't feed the trolls. We've all heard this.
No, that's good advice.
If you think about what their purpose is, their purpose is probably twofold or threefold. One is attention seeking. So it doesn't matter what the attention is. Yes, when you retweet them and you make fun of them, the attention from your followers is going to be negative, but they're not concerned whether it's positive or negative. They're just interested in that narcissistic supply. So you're giving it to them. Number two, they're wasting your time. And I think that's also very important. So I think especially when they attack not your professional life, but your personal life, personally, I would think of them as being disordered or maladaptive, maybe subclinically, and I would not give them what they want.
Good advice.
Yeah, I mean, again, it sounds like Captain Obvious, but when you actually think the psychology of trolling, there's some very interesting
No, you had a video where you mentioned this. Yeah, you mentioned this in the incel video, and actually I didn't even think about applying that to my own situation. I just thought about it theoretically, because I always think in theory. I don't oftentimes apply things to my practical life. And that's kind of the reason I want to do this talk, is because what you say does apply. So I appreciate that. And you did mention something in the video about how the person who does the sort of trolling as a way to achieve validation is actually doing it under the guise of, I forget how you worded it, but you were talking about how it appears that they're undermining and crusading, but actually what they're doing is achieving a kind of validation and narcissistic supply, is I think the way you said it.
Yeah, I mean, there's one particular psychologist on YouTube whom I like, and I think he's a master's of psychology. So once again, he's not just a layperson like me, and he has a number of videos where he analyzes public figures along the political spectrum. So he talks about, on the quote unquote, very thick quotation marks, Breivik as a mass shooter having been diagnosed officially in his trial with the narcissistic personality disorder. And then he contrasts him with, I can't believe that video is still up, with social justice warriors. And he basically talks about the fact that the most aggressive ones display many of the signs of vulnerable and covert narcissism, where they want to erase these hierarchies, not because they're achieving a particular political goal,
exactly.
but but because they're actually fulfilling a certain reality that is a little bit twisted in their mind, and kind of fulfilling their own hidden grandiose fantasies about where they should actually be in terms of social status.
That's the same with the overreaction to women. That was kind of the point of your whole video on that phenomena, was that criticizing the modern e-girl is one thing, but the movement into the irrational hatred of women, which is where that movement goes a lot of times, is absolutely insane.
Yeah, and I try to be careful with my disclaimers, saying that most likely most people you encounter who are maladaptive are probably subclinical, and this applies to kind of exaggerated cases. But obviously that particular comment really struck a chord with these individuals, which was actually one of my points, that they're hypersensitive. That's one of the traits of covert or vulnerable narcissism, and getting some hate mail was pretty interesting validation in that regard, because like I said, it's a brand new channel in the sense that I'm doing it in a very guerrilla way. I'm using an old smartphone to record. I need to upgrade all that. But so that was very validating.
Right. Are there any more red flags before we move on to the ideas of some of the other videos that you mentioned? Any other major traits that stick out, like
well, you should look at the person's life history. Now, it's not, again, we're thinking about a new person that you're meeting. It's not always possible to, hire a private investigator, but you should look at the way they treat their friends. Do they have any friends? Do they move around a lot? Do they move around a lot because there is a legitimate reason, because their job has moved them? Or do they burn bridges and basically destroy any interpersonal relationships they have had in their previous community? So they're sort of, are they charming? Now, naturally people are attracted to someone, and I would differentiate between naturally charismatic and charming, where it's very superficial.
Okay. Yeah.
And a lot of times at social events, people are charming, and it's not always easy to tell whether they're basically just trying to fit in at the social event, or whether they're trying to achieve a particular goal. But I am now very wary of people who are charming, and I would like to have them at my party, but I would not want to have them in my life as, let's say, a long-term friend or something like that. So again, these things are kind of more subtle. Like charm is more subtle. Insulting a cab driver is more subtle. I would look at if something more obvious with grandiose narcissism, how entitled they are. Do they feel like they need the best seat at the restaurant? Do they feel like they should not wait in line? Do they cut lines? Are they trying to make decisions for you where it's inappropriate and you've just met them?
Right. But what do you do when you're somebody like me and you're in a situation where you actually are entitled to that best seat in the restaurant? Like, how do you?
You should talk to Dr. Phil and see how he deals with not being granted that at all times.
Okay, I'm gonna tweet Dr. Phil tomorrow that question. I actually will.
You should look at if they're hostile and irritable. Again, there might be a reasonable explanation, like they're sleep deprived and overworked.
Right.
But it might actually be a very bad sign. And again, you're looking at all of these things in a complex over however long you know this person. Is this a repeated behavior?
Right.
Is this behavior escalating? Is it getting worse? So depending on whether we're talking about family members or a romantic relationship or a boss, it would be a little bit different with what you're seeing. So
I think
is this person deceitful? Is this person trashing every ex-girlfriend? ex-boyfriend. I mean, every single one.
So
Is
you're
this
saying
person
they're
trashing every
bisexual.
woman in their life?
You're saying they're bisexual? No, I'm joking. You said
Yeah, exactly. Is this person always cynical and making snarky jokes? Again, sometimes that may not mean anything, but if there are other traits. I mean, I used to make snarky jokes, and then I did a little bit of engaging in self-reflection, and I realized it's not a very good thing. But again, we're looking at the long term, the patterns, and the other traits. But it begins with really small things that you might not even consider unless you look at these, multiple YouTube videos and Psychology Today and all this popular information that's out there. So,
okay. What about what about covert narcissism? So how is this different from overt?
well, some of the traits are the same, and in terms of diagnostic criteria, I believe, if I understand it correctly, currently only grandiose narcissism gets the diagnosis of NPD, although the vulnerable current counterpart is recognized not as a diagnosis, and it could be equally harmful, but in other ways. So there is that same sense of self-importance, but it's not projected outward. This is not a bombastic public speaker who presents this image of being larger than life. This is someone who might actually come across as meek and who will always complain about having, being slighted everywhere they go. Everyone is always doing something bad to them. There's always a crisis in their life. And I mean, sometimes there might be a crisis. That's why it's so difficult to tell. They basically share the same belief in being special and unique as the grandiose diagnosable counterpart, but it's not, again, projected to the outside world. That's why if you read incel message boards, you would see it, but it's not sort of publicly displayed. So they have the same sense of entitlement. They're equally interpersonally exploitative, but it would come up in different ways. Whereas, let's say a grandiose narcissist might go into an overt rage, sometimes even violence, to get what they want. The vulnerable narcissist would use more covert behaviors like guilt tripping or disappearing for days, the silent treatment, and so on and so forth. So it's something that is popularly known as passive aggression. Yeah. I like the term covert aggression, but generally the meaning is the same, that it's kind of like under the radar. Right. I'm always the hurt party. I'm always the victim. And, once you know this person well enough, you probably realize that they're not always the victim. In fact, they're the aggressor, but they're using these roundabout ways too. And if you think about what they're doing, is they're basically they're fighting for what they want, but they're not fighting for what they want in an overt way by yelling at you, for instance. They're getting what they want by using these passive, covert ways. Yes. So, but they're still fighting. Is just a different way to fight and to get what they want. And I think it's very important to understand, that's where the aggression part comes in. So, but unlike grandiose narcissists, they're not going to demonstrate that they're arrogant to others in the open.
So one of the things that sent me down this rabbit hole a couple of years ago was some people that I was interacting with, and got me reading on the subject. And one thing I noticed, and I think you perhaps mentioned it in one of the videos, if not, you can correct me, but I noticed the characteristic of total inability ever to admit, even in the smallest degree, any mistake or error. Not just on a moral level, it was really, shitty that you punched me in the face, but even to the most basic level of oh, you had a fact wrong about, the World Series. It actually wasn't that year. No, I'm right. Never. I've met two people who I've never in my life heard them ever admit that they ever made any mistake or got anything wrong.
It's actually very interesting because you could look at the psychological makeup of that person, and it's probably, if there are other traits involved, a pretty disordered person, because if you look at the way the narcissist is constructed. There's the true self that is essentially eroded, and then there's the false self, which is basically a series of these primitive defenses like envy and rage and so forth. And if they were to admit that they're wrong, their whole false self would basically collapse. And that's how this is the way they operate in the world. Like they would have serious psychological issues if they were to admit that they're wrong, because their false self would collapse basically.
So they have like a mirror thing that's very fragile, that any
the inside has essentially been like eaten away at whatever age if you follow kind of the popular analysis of how a narcissist is formed, it's usually childhood trauma, or exactly. it's extreme validation as this little god running around. Basically, you're either denigrating the child or you're excessively praising them, but it's always praising them for actions as opposed to like, oh, you're kind and empathetic, et cetera, et cetera. So at whatever age their emotional development is stunted, that's what you'll see. And it's actually pretty fascinating. If you have children, you will see a lot of these narcissistic behaviors, but of course in children, it's developmentally appropriate.
Right.
So I don't know if you come across, nephews, nieces, someone else's kids on a somewhat regular basis. Have you ever seen a kid admit that they're wrong? They would go blame their brother.
Exactly.
It's exactly that. Of course, they don't have a false self like an adult narcissist, but a lot of those things that are developmentally appropriate in kids, like really rapid mood swings from mom, I hate you to mom, I love you. When you see that in an adult, obviously it's inappropriate, that inability to control your emotions on a very basic level. So it's pretty fascinating to compare what kids do, and for them it being normal when they're 3, 4, 5, and what adults do, and it's absolutely not. So
yeah, I know in the case of one person I'm thinking of, there was an early trauma at age 4, I think, where there was an accidental death involved. And I think it really messed up it wasn't the person's fault as the child that was involved. But I think that it probably damaged that person to the extent that they felt like the solution perhaps was to erect the notion of that ever admitting anything had been done wrong would mean that they were weak. So they had to build an image that they were completely strong and invincible to overcome.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely relevant, but I would also say there would have probably been some kind of emotional neglect on a part of a caregiver or some important adult, like whatever, teacher, coach, depending on what their family situation was like. Or excessive validation, like you're always the best, you're the best artist in the world, you're the best singer, et cetera, et cetera. So in some families, it's actually pretty interesting. And I can think of personal experiences where one parent is extremely aggressive and denigrating and verbally abusive, and the other parent just praises the hell out of you. And so basically this child who grows up with stunted emotional development spends his or her entire life running from the abusive, so to speak, pole to this kind of total, allowance of everything. Everything is permissible. Everything is permitted. And then that is expressed in very low impulse control, which is one of the important traits of these maladaptive personalities. It's not so much associated with narcissists, although it's sometimes prevalent. It's more so associated with sociopathy, psychopathy, and the diagnostic antisocial personality disorder, but it's never like a clear picture. A lot of people that I would say they display narcissistic traits have very low impulse control. So
yeah, which is why I guess at times they could snap and perhaps try to kill somebody
Yes,
not
and I
under
think that's kind of interesting because again, in terms of popular culture, there's so much debate as to what is a sociopath, what is a psychopath, and
Right.
what is the antisocial personality disorder. And to make matters worse, certain YouTube psychologists with their PhDs give you a slightly different answer. One would say, oh, a psychopath is born, a sociopath is made. Then they would kind of muddy the water with saying, well, no, of course, certain genes are only activated in certain environmental conditions. It's never genes alone. And my point is that a sociopath or the antisocial personality disorder, there is significant criminality, whereas a psychopath does not necessarily have to have a criminal record. It could be like a white collar criminal, or it could be, as we've mentioned earlier, Hollywood director, CEO, politician, etc. So
what is the so next you went on to cover things like when you are with this person, or you have this person as, say, a family member or a boss. It's really bad when it's a boss situation. I've had multiple bosses who were just completely insane, demonic, possessed type bosses. So people will say things like, why didn't you just leave this person in this relationship? And then you did another video about 5 ways that you feel great after you do leave these kinds of situations. So sometimes you might not be able to leave, like if you're in the household.
I mean, I think with the work scenario, obviously there might, it's obviously different from a romantic partnership or a family of origin, where either it's elderly parents that you're taking care of, or you're not an adult, you're a teenager, you can't leave. In a work situation, obviously, ideally, you should try to find another job if the person in a position of power is, kind of ticking all the boxes for these maladaptive traits. And I would say with, the two most difficult ones are, of course, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife. So basically intimate partner and family of origin, because there are all these unspoken social, cultural, family obligations that are kind of intertwined into the maladaptive situation. So let's say you have 2 parents, they're married, one of them is neurotypical and one of them perhaps not a clinical, whatever the diagnosis would be, but quite harmful. It's, the psychologist might say, well, cut off contact, but it's impossible if you want to maintain contact with the other parent. So it's not easy to do so, but I think one of the more traumatic ones, of course, would be an intimate partnership when you live with this person and things basically escalate. And what happens is that there is this cycle of intermittent positive reward. Basically, think of Pavlov's dogs and dog training. And then there's the cycle of abuse. And sometimes it's verbal, it could be physical. And in the meantime, you're walking on eggshells, you're anticipating this next explosion to come. And sometimes in popular culture, it's described as the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde personality. So what happens, as this happens over and over and over again, is that the timing between the reward, and it could be, let's say this person is physically violent, he or she has assaulted you. And I do want to make a point that sometimes it does pertain to women. Absolutely. I've personally spoken to men who have been subject of disordered women, and they absolutely do not want to report this because it's embarrassing. Anyway, away from my digression. So the period between the reward, quote unquote, it could be an apology, it could be a gift, it could be a trip, it could really be anything. And this next rage, the silent treatment, disappearing for days, whatever it might be in a particular case, it gets longer. So there are less and less rewards, kind of like, roughly speaking, you training your dog are no longer rewarding the dog with treats for whatever the dog is supposed to perform, sit, shake, So as this is happening and you're walking on eggshells because this person is completely unpredictable, think about all the bodily changes that are happening to you. Your reptilian brain is always, activated, and you're constantly
Are you talking about David Icke? Mode. Are you talking about David Icke?
Yes, the lizard people. Yeah. But you have the 4 fight or flight, there's the 4 Fs basically: fight, flight, fawn, and sorry, what's the last one?
F-U-C-K,
And freeze,
right?
and freeze. And I'm sure you've seen this. And so basically, when this happens, there's this hormone dump, right? And so as this happens over and over and over again, your body chemistry is completely out of whack. And when there's the quote unquote reward, I'm so sorry I did this and that to you, or here's a gift, I'm so sorry I did this and that to you, you get this massive dopamine release. So it's like adrenaline, cortisol on the bad side, quote unquote, and dopamine on the good side. And you know, these hormones and neurotransmitters are there for a reason, but when it happens on such a frequent basis, it really screws up your body chemistry. You're exhausted all the time, and you can have a whole slew of issues. There are some studies about autoimmune issues, people gaining weight, people losing weight, thyroid issues, and so on and so forth. And there's also some kind of unofficial documented cases of people being able to leave these scenarios and then their body chemistry is back to normal. But that scenario is basically, this is why it's called a trauma bond, is that you kind of have, I think initially it came out with little children who were raised in abusive households where, you know, the same parent is the good parent, quote unquote, and the bad parent. And so the child is really kind of accustomed to the good and the bad, and that sort of body chemistry being out of whack. And so you have this almost bodily chemical dependence on the situation. So this is why when you leave, it feels so, it just feels so traumatic. It's been compared to having withdrawal from a drug. Serious chemical dependency by multiple psychologists and scientists.
So the trauma bond aspect of this also makes me think of the aspects of cults, exactly. Stockholm Syndrome, this kind of stuff. So as you guys know in the audience, we've covered cults many, many, many times. And so you'll start to see that what Nina's talking about is very relevant to the sphere of cults, cult of personality, and how cult leaders use these tricks, tactics, techniques. Most of the time, I would say it's probably a fair guess that cult leaders are narcissistic psychopaths. I don't think there's...
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think actually a very good way to remember this is that not every narcissist is a psychopath, but every psychopath is a narcissist.
Okay.
So there's some pretty interesting studies of cult leaders, specifically in the US, from the psychological standpoint. Not assessments, I guess, because... you know, officially to diagnose someone, you have to interview them, et cetera, et cetera. So there are assessments, but, you know, I would say they sound pretty accurate to me. So definitely that direct connection between cult psychology and these narcissistic or psychopathic relationships. In fact, that some of these mental health professionals call let's say, a marriage to a highly narcissistic person a cult of one, basically.
Right.
So.
You mentioned, let's see, a technique called gray rock, which is placing a gray rock underneath the pillow of the evil spouse, correct? And this
yes, and then doing evil Slavic spells.
Right. So put a Slavic Russian, put a Dugan spell, right? A Dugan spell upon
the infamous Eurasianist Mongolian supremacist spell. Yes, it always works. Do not try this at home.
Very good work, Nina. We'll send you Soviet
You should not have mentioned this. Tomorrow, the Daily Beast will be covering the bearded Rasputin.
You will get the extra Soviet-backed Bitcoin tonight. Extra
yes, exactly.
Soviet-backed
Soviet Bitcoins. That sounds enticing, actually.
So tell us about how I'd never heard of this. You talk about this gray rock method. So if you do have a psychopath in your sphere that you have to deal with, this is an interesting technique, and in the regards to the person that I know, I did think that this was a helpful piece of advice. If you want to mention this when it can be done.
Yeah, it's basically exactly what it sounds like. When you implement gray rock, you are supposed to be as boring as a gray rock. You know, not many things that are more boring than a great rock. I mean, I guess unless you're like into the Japanese Shinto religion, but I digress. So basically The only time I would not use this technique is if the person you're dealing with is physically violent, not necessarily towards you, because there is that propensity for violence, even if it's just punching walls. And you have to be, for whatever reason, one-on-one with this person, because this may send the person in question into a rage. So in all other scenarios, it's fine to use gray rock, and basically you are retraining this maladaptive, dysfunctional person in your life for the long-term, pervasive, harmful patterns of behavior that you've observed to realize that you're no longer going to be giving them this attention, as some people call it narcissistic supply. So let's say they respond, they send you something and it's a paragraph. You respond in one line in the most boring way possible, and you do this over and over again. You ignore their attempts to trigger you and to get into some kind of an argument. And it's helpful for, let's say family of origin situation where you cannot cut off contact with, your boomer uncle who is who is a big I don't know, Jeb Bush fan or something like that. So you have to implement this over and over again and be consistent, and you're slowly retraining them, once again, rough analogy of dog training, to think that you're no longer going to be giving them this narcissistic supply. And you sent me that video by Jamie, which I'm yet to watch, but I saw the title has the word vampire.
Right.
Which is very relevant. I mean, it sounds kind of exaggerated because these people really feed off of your emotions, and they don't care if these are positive emotions or negative emotions. What they want is your emotions, because that validates them. So when they send you something, I hate to use the word triggering because of the social justice associations, but basically something triggering in an attempt to get you to argue with something that's offensive to you, something that's not true, what they want is this explosion of negative emotions coming from you. And that's how they feed off of that, which is why the vampire analogy is relevant. And this is precisely why you're retraining them to realize that you're no longer going to be doing this. You're just boring. They're going to have to move on to another source of not blood, but narcissistic supply.
So if I spell vampire Pyre, is that just eccentricity, or is that a narcissistic trait?
Once again, I would defer to Dr. Phil and see what he would say about that subject.
Well, he would probably debunk vampires. He would have to explain
he would,
that they're
yes,
not real,
because he's very rational. Yes, that's very true.
I'm not sure about that. But anyway, gaslighting. So talk about gaslighting, because as you know, here on my channel, we have covered many, many films. And one of the first films that we covered in one of the lectures I did many years ago was George Cukor's film Gaslight, which is a great movie. And if you watch the movie, go ahead.
I mean, do you want to tell your listeners briefly what the movie is about? That the female protagonist is slowly being driven insane, and how she's being driven insane.
So Ingrid Bergman has a suitor, and her suitor is a guy that she believes is some dandy fop of some sort of noble character, and he's not. He's actually a con man, but he's fairly clever at his con artistry, because he has rigged a lot of things, including the house itself, to appear to have ghosts and all kinds of nonsense. And this drives Ingrid gradually more and more insane, believing she's insane. And he's, of course, fostering this the entire time. He's moving her objects around, throwing away objects, hiding objects, telling her to her face, after he's done stuff, I didn't do that, after he just obviously did it, this kind of thing. So hence the term gaslight, as it's known to most of us. I won't spoil the movie if you haven't seen it, because it's a great movie. But tell us the signs of gaslighting.
Yeah, I mean, so the term comes from that film, and it's basically a technique that is used over the long term in order to affect the very perception of reality of your target. And the reasons for doing so may be simple control. If it's a family of origin or a romantic partner, it may be something financial if it's a business partner. So the reasons for this may be very different, but the technique is basically a way of having you experience a very piercing sense of cognitive dissonance over and over again. And a lot of times it starts off again in a seemingly benign way. This person does something that is not good. You have either witnessed it or yourself with your own eyes, so again, the five senses, or you've heard about it and you know this is factual information, and this person begins denying it, foaming at the mouth, and they're believable. And at first, when this happens, you just scoff, like, this is crazy. I can't believe he's denying something that I've seen with my own eyes. But the way our psychology works is if you are neurotypical and you see this, and then you see this person is offended, this person stops talking to you, and you start thinking about the way you would act in a situation, and you think, well, I would be very offended if someone didn't believe me because I was telling the truth. And as time goes on, matter of days, maybe a week, you start justifying their excuses, even though initially you may have witnessed what they're doing with your own two eyes. And it's pretty remarkable that this is the way, our brain is wired essentially to start questioning it. And so when this is something that happens over and over again, as it happens initially, in each instance, you experience this sense of surreal cognitive dissonance because it challenges what you're seeing, as in the movie, the lights being dimmed, right? Mm-hmm. So, and basically, there are all these kind of other factors that are to be considered. So let's say it's an abusive romantic situation. The target is likely isolated from their friends and family at this stage. There's not a lot of validation of reality where you could say to your sister, your best friend, whatever, well, this happened, and, he or she can validate or not. So your only reference to reality is this person who is constantly gaslighting you. Mm-hmm. And it's actually pretty fascinating because I think a lot of these YouTubers start off here and then they extrapolate to, group level, like cults, and then national and international level politics, right? In my case, it was the opposite. You look at the way the media in an echo chamber covers certain events, and if you have the benefit of being able to read or understand other, realize that, the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq were not there, for instance. And this is a way to, keep the population, depending on what the particular situation is. But it happens in the media and in politics on a daily basis. So
I'm glad you mentioned that because I did want to talk about how people in the audience, one of the things I've covered quite a bit is also psychological warfare. So all the stuff that Nina is mentioning is very applicable to that realm of stuff as well. So you'll notice patterns and similarities in the way that the media, the way that propaganda works to gaslight as well.
Right, exactly. And it's, I would love to cover more of the subject, but again, listening to or observing YouTube censorship policies, you kind of have to be careful careful with that. But you could talk about government A engaging in a certain type of psyop operation, whatever. So.
There was a good. We'll do some questions here in a little bit if you guys want to send super chats. I see we've got a few already, and then I've got a few that people have written down that'll be good. But what are you mentioned your newest video? You talk about the tendency of the narcissist in your life to monopolize and suck away your time, and you spend about 12 minutes on that. Is there anything you want to remind us about there that is key? Because this is another one of the things that they do is that they try to.
Well, basically, time is one of the parameters in which this maladaptive individual can get his or her narcissistic supply attention, in other words. And a lot of times it starts off in a very seemingly benign way where, as I've mentioned there, this might be someone who is a little bit late. And of course, we've all been late because we've had legitimate reasons and there's a legitimate explanation and you write this off. But as time goes on, you realize that you're constantly waiting around on this person. And basically, the statement could be made, we don't start until I get here. So there's that sense of entitlement and grandiosity embedded into being late. And then you slowly realize that it's being done deliberately. And as this is happening, this is accompanied by other ways of monopolizing your time, sort of complaining about you spending, time on solitary hobbies, on your friends. And a lot of times, again, it seems to sound legitimate. This person wants to spend more time with you. And again, it doesn't have to be, romantic partner. It could be family of origin, family member. And eventually, this person completely monopolizes you to the point where you lose your very identity. It's also applicable to cult psychology here, but it starts off in seemingly benign ways by, not being punctual.
Yes, that's great. Yeah. Let's see in a bit. Someone asked a great question about, do you see a connection between like prevalent philosophies in society like nihilism? Could that contribute to the prevalence of things like narcissism?
Absolutely. There are multiple, both psychologists and kind of popular YouTubers who are not psychologists who've commented on this. If you look at, it's difficult to keep accurate statistics of this because it's either mental health professionals reporting it or it's self-reported. But one statistic I had seen is that I think it's like 0.1% of narcissism in East Asia compared to the anywhere between 2 to 10% of diagnosable NPD in America. So there's clearly something about the individualist culture with all the implications of nihilism, et cetera, versus the more communally oriented East Asians. And of course, they're also affected by, globalism and so forth. But some of these studies that I'd seen had significant differences in documenting these conditions at the level of a personality disorder. So if you think about the types of values that are promoted in our culture in terms of cutthroat competition in the workplace, so that you want to become the CEO, you want to run a company, you probably don't want to have too much empathy, which empathy lacking is one of the traits of narcissism. You probably don't want to have too much empathy if you have to lay off 1,200 people. So all of these things that are good for business are actually, let's say in the short term, maybe not in the long term, are actually traits of narcissism. So if they're being promoted as a cultural value, then how can we function if it's considered to be a positive in the workplace, to be highly successful, and it's considered to be awful in interpersonal relationships? There is this real significant clash. So we could extrapolate this to the criticism of late stage capitalism to make it even more broad.
The social Darwinism in terms of capitalism is the same mindset here. And actually, if you have the John Ronson book, which that's the one that I have on psychopaths, his psychopath test, he covers some of those characteristics as well, as especially in the realm of CEOs and people in hedge funds and this kind of stuff. That's the perfect arena for this kind of a conscience-free zone, right, where we're freed from.
Yes, exactly. So it's pretty remarkable that and you watch some of these. I'm all for girls being professionally accomplished, but when you watch these promotional videos with what do you want to be when you grow up, and they say, I want to be a CEO, they don't even say of what. They just have that social status of being, at the top of the corporation. It's a pretty scary thing that's happening. So
do you advocate becoming a super narcissist to defeat the narcissist in your life?
It's actually kind of funny that you mentioned this. I don't know if you're familiar with Sam Vaknin, but he's one of these. If you Google narcissism, he's one of the first people to come up. He is not a psychologist or a mental health professional. Nonetheless, there is kind of this love-hate relationship. Some people absolutely consider him an expert and invite him to events. Other people are pretty skeptical of him. He claims to be a diagnosed narcissist. According to a movie in which he was in, he is a diagnosed psychopath, which I guess says he is also a narcissist. But he basically almost has that strategy that he is challenging narcissism by being a super narcissist because he understands it himself so well. And supposedly he was a genius, like a wunderkind in Israel when he grew up. So he clearly has enough intelligence to extrapolate, like usually narcissists are not supposed to have that level of self-reflection.
That's what I was going to ask. Are they
clearly
self-aware?
is. He is self-aware. I find, he's one of the first, when you start going down the rabbit hole of the subject, he's probably the first person you'll find. And I find a lot of his work very useful, and I'm not, communicating with him as a friend. So it doesn't matter to me if he's a diagnosed narcissist, psychopath, or whatever else. If you want to look up a movie called Psychopath on YouTube, I think it's in like 8 parts or 10 parts. It's about him. It's fascinating. So anyway, but here is this super narcissist who is now on a crusade to fight narcissists in a very grandiose crusade. It's a pretty interesting, phenomenon, and I'm pretty sure he understands that.
So he's like Dexter. He's gonna take out.
Yes, okay. Exactly. He's the Dexter of malignant narcissism. He's very great. His book, Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, is like a doorstopper. It's like books on Heidegger all put together. It's like 1,000 pages or something. Whoa. It's amazing.
Somebody asked, have you seen the documentary Party Monster, and would this guy qualify?
I have not, but just based on the title, it sounds like this is someone with very low impulse control. So clearly there's... Again, just based on the title, it sounds like there are some dysfunctional traits that could be present, yes.
Whoever wrote that question, go ahead and remind me I don't remember who you said this documentary is about.
I think it's as far as popular culture goes, we haven't talked about the borderline personality disorder, which is usually associated with women.
Okay.
Although there's certainly men who have that. And sometimes it's described as female narcissism. Mm-hmm. The 1 or 2 differences is the fact that there's pretty significant suicidal ideation. And there's some borderlines who are kind of harmful to themselves, but there's some who are harmful to others. So the 2 movies that you could think of that portray this in popular culture would be Fatal Attraction and Single White Female. So if you've ever experienced a female stalker who is trying to be like you, trying to interfere in your marriage, et cetera, like I have, it's a pretty terrifying thing. So that's another sort of predatory personality that we haven't discussed. I haven't really covered much, but in popular culture, it's certainly there.
Do you have any brief comments on analysis on why that manifests the way that it does? What is what's your analysis of why is it an extreme lack of, what's the word I'm looking for? Are they searching for an identity and trying to take your identity?
Usually the official psychological reason is that they experience significant childhood trauma. Mm-hmm. They completely lack their identity, so they search. Okay. And, you probably have seen like the high school girlfriend with every new boyfriend. She completely adapts his music tastes, his, interests in skateboarding, guitars, whatever. Like you've seen that. Granted, in high school, it might have been just a little bit of infantility.
Immaturity, yeah.
But yes, it's basically lacking identity and, the fact that they have pretty significant suicidal ideation should tell you about their emotional state and their mood swings. But their perception of reality is, like with narcissists, is quite skewed. And, to put it in layman's terms, they take it out on you. So, and they have this insane fear of abandonment, which you see in these films.
So Party Monster, says, is the 2003 film directed by Fenton Bailey and Randy Barbato about the New York City party promoter named Michael Allig. And he's...
I know the story. I have not seen the movie.
Okay.
Interesting.
Supposed to be one of these kind of people, yeah.
If you start looking at... sometimes I binge in the form of a podcast, I guess, on
right.
True crime on YouTube.
I do that too, yeah.
And you start looking at it from that perspective, or the news about certain famous politician or whoever. It really opens your eyes to what's going on, and you can almost predict what the next thing that's going to come is, because you have looked at these traits in kind of a complex way. So
What do you think about American Psycho? I know it's a satire, but do you think that it's relevant to this in any way?
It is relevant. I have not seen it, so I probably should refrain from commenting
you would like
on
that.
it.
You'll like that. Let's see.
Yeah, I mean, I literally sometimes listen to these. I mean, again, going down the rabbit hole of true crime on YouTube. You know, there are a lot of interrogations like Jodi Arias and things like that. I mean, it's pretty fascinating to some of those. What is it? Alec Manassian's interrogation. I believe his trial should be starting, as far as incels go, either now or it has started in Canada. And you listen to the interrogation, and it's just amazing from, you know, in a bad way to keep recognizing these traits based on what they're saying. So.
All right, so we'll move to the super chats now. By the way, I have Nina's channel is linked there if you want to subscribe to her content. She's putting out videos pretty regularly on these topics. It's there in the description, so subscribe to her. And let's see, we got Palmer Eric. I can't say my R's anymore.
Is that what, how would you analyze the people who can't say their R's? What's their deficiency?
Palmer Elric, $2. Trying here some Nick Cage bring the Cajun rage. I don't know about that. Palmer again says, thank you for the quality content. You bet, Palmer. Much appreciated for those super chats. $20, much appreciated. Russian anime bot, $5 says, my KGB tithe, best to you comrades. You're welcome, and Dugan give you a mystical occult blessing right now with
KGB, FSB, GRU, or whatever the new the new term for it is. Mongolian supremacist is what I like to
Mongolian supremacist, there we go. You
get
Mongolian
it really triggers.
Blessing. Fresh whole milk, $7.99. Good work, comrades from Soviet Union. Soon Dugan will destroy all of white man. Yes, that's what we're here for.
Have you actually, as a side note, have you seen Dugan's Facebook lately?
I do not. I hate Facebook. I do not go on there.
I mean, it's public content. I think anyone could see it. But he posts these bizarre puppets that I think they're cats or dogs. They look very retro and creepy, but it's like in a philosophical context. So either he's like a super troll or
he's super
I'm
memeing.
I'm kind of disturbed by
he's
by
super
that,
memeing. So. Okay.
Yeah.
Meta memeing. Anybody else have any super chats? We had a good chat here. This is I'm trying to keep my shows now to around hour, a little over an hour. So we've had fun. I had one last question about: are you familiar with the technique of mama birding in these situations?
Sorry, you're breaking up for me now. Can you repeat what you said?
I said, in terms of dealing with psychopaths, are you familiar with the technique that some people recommend of mama birding?
No, I have not. What is that? It's interesting.
It's basically where you will chew up the food for the person, spit it into their mouth, and they're so disoriented by this practice that you basically train them to be your baby bird.
Have you seen this on Dr. Phil?
That was just some nonsense I made up. That's not
No, I just... I could see that on Dr. Phil. It does sound like a person who would be on Dr. Phil. It does sound like Dr. Phil, yes.
I saw a dude on there.
I think... Go ahead.
There was a dude on there the other day who said that he's Batman.
Oh, so okay. I did you see the one with a lady who was convinced that she's communicating with Putin psychically or something like that?
No, but that one sounds awesome.
Yeah, it was kind of awesome, but also kind of disturbing. I think obviously very exploitative to have someone that.
Yeah, that's what people are starting to say. I noticed there's a couple episodes where when the people walk off, I can't tell what's dramatized and staged drama on that show and what's real. But the two times that I have seen clips of people getting directed to leave, it's when they call Dr. Phil out on the drama. They're like, you ain't doing nothing. You ain't doing nothing but sitting here trying to capitalize on my situation and cause drama and make a scene.
Get out of here.
That's when he'll go, you need to get up right now and walk out that door.
That's why you don't call Dr. Phil a narcissist to his face.
Okay. That's how you get booted. All right.
Yeah.
People in the chat are like, WTF to my mama bird joke. I just always make the mama bird joke.
This is what happens when you have particular YouTube advertising. And obviously Jay and I have the same Dr. Phil clips.
He has
so.
mind controlled me. Dr. Phil's my handler now. It's no longer Dugan that's my handler. It's now Dr. Phil. So there's no telling what's going to come
That's a lot more covert. I'm sure. Again, don't tell the Daily Beast, because this might be a headline tomorrow. So.
Okay. I forgot to put your Twitter on there. I will put it in the show description later. But if you want to follow her on Twitter, it is Nina Byzantina. Very easy to find. And of course, again, subscribe to her channel. There, Inside the Mind of a Human Predator. A lot of good videos there. Anything else you want to leave us with, Nina?
No, thank you for having me. I will try to carefully pursue either the political direction or kind of more popular cultural commentary, again, within the parameters of YouTube. So I think if people are interested in kind of greater meaning behind some of these maladaptive traits and how it can apply not only to their immediate surroundings, but, the greater culture at large, international politics, I'm definitely going to pursue that angle carefully.
Awesome. All right. Thank you.
So thank you for having me.
You bet.
You can come back anytime. You did one last thing before we go. For people that are interested, in one of your videos, you have a few of the book recommendations. You don't have to list all 5 unless you know them off the top of your head. If you want to list some of the books that you found relevant, you have a video on that. But what are the ones that you think are good for this topic?
Snakes and Suits is the first one I mentioned, by Dr. Hare, and of course, his other works on psychopaths meant for general public are very helpful. Joe Navarro's the ex-FBI agent. Dangerous Personalities is amazing, and he's not a psychologist, but as someone who had worked in that criminal field, he basically, and that was my number 1 book, which is why I'm focusing on it now. He isolates 4 personality types, so it's not quite according to the cluster B criteria, but sometimes it coincides, and he gives you these amazingly long checklists. So if you do have a maladaptive person in your life, you can look at the 120 points, let's say, for one of them that he gives you, and you can just kind of check them off to see if, the person you're dealing with is actually quite harmful and it's not just all in your head. So that's another book. And there's Dr. Ramani's Should I Stay or Should I Go? A book on narcissism, in terms of exactly what it says. How do I handle a situation from which I cannot leave? And I believe I had one legal one, which was splitting. I think it was about divorcing a narcissist or a borderline, which was more like practical advice. And I cannot for the life of me remember what was number 5, but I think my Kindle on my iPad has probably 50 titles on the subject, again, for popular consumption. But that kind of tells you that, they're not the kinds of books that I'd want to display on a bookshelf, but it's pretty convenient to download them. They're, affordable, and you can highlight stuff that's useful for you. So a lot of the sounds may sound like Captain Obvious stuff, but it really isn't until you've experienced it yourself, and then you can look at patterns. Most people look at incidents. They do not look at patterns, and that's when the rose-colored glasses fall off and you realize what you're dealing with. So
awesome. Well, thank you very much, and hopefully we'll have you back soon to talk about something equally as interesting. But this was great.
More cult stuff, absolutely. Thank you, Jay. I'll talk to you soon.